So today we have Paul Griffiths with us um, to talk about his new book and maybe other things, Mr. Beethoven, which is amazing. And we all got our copies. And you have many fans in Ithaca. At least 5 of us in this town have read your book.
Well, that's very good to know. If that were
Yes.
reproduced around the world.
I know, it's very sweet. So Rick Faria is to my left or whatever, clarinet professor at Ithaca College, and of course, friend of Paul's who met him back in 2005, and my dear colleague and head of the Keyboard Center, Annette Richards, keyboard organist and music historian extraordinaire. So I thought, Annette, I'd let you kick off with a question for Paul, if you want.
I would love to. I would love to. Paul, it is such a delight to meet you, and I have so enjoyed reading this book, which I too have right here. I love it. I think the idea is brilliant. Just for people listening who don't know the book yet, you'll know more by the end of this hour. But I guess just to say quickly, rather than dying in 1827, Beethoven travels to Boston to compose an oratorio for the Handel and Haydn Society. It's a fantastic idea. But of course, I love the way the idea is much more than that. It's a book about historical fiction. It's a book about doing history. And it's especially about doing music history, or that's what it felt like when you're a music historian reading it. It's about how we reconstruct the past, I guess, from fragments of archival evidence. It's about how those stories we tell might or might not reflect what actually happened. That's one of the things I love about the way you kind of turn back on the way of telling stories. I suspected as I was reading it that it was also a bit of a dig at music scholarship in the best possible way. We can talk about that a bit. And of course, it's hugely entertaining. So I suppose the first question for you is, what were you thinking when you started this project? Where did Mr. Beethoven come from? And what did it feel like to be creating fiction about one of music history's probably best known figures? Pretty daunting, I would imagine.
Yeah, and at first I must thank you for that introduction and everything that you say about the book. But the starting point was reading that there had been this commission from the Handel and Haydn Society conveyed to Beethoven in Vienna in, I think, 1823. And he didn't say no, but of course he never got around to it because at that time he had other things on his mind, the Ninth Symphony, the Missa Solemnis, and then the late quartets. So I imagine him living a few more years younger, a few more years longer. After all, he was only 56 when he died, so it's not stretching possibility too much to imagine him living into his mid-60s and actually fulfilling this this commission. And he would have wanted, and Handel and Haydn Society surely would have wanted him to go. So he has to be the first notable Western composer to travel across the Atlantic, I think 50 years before anybody else does. So we start with him on the boat, going across to Boston. And you said it's a bit of a spoof music history and musicology. It's also a spoof on, well, I think you said this too, a spoof historical fiction. That I lay out what my research is, but of course I'm not researching something that was, I'm researching something that might have been. So these days, because there's so much information online, you can do this from here in coastal Wales. I can consult the National Archives in Washington, DC, and I can see actually the document, I can see passenger list for a boat that went from Amsterdam to Boston. Obviously, he's got to end up in Boston, so the simplest way is to get a boat straight there. And I chose Amsterdam as the port of embarkation because you could, by stagecoaches, get across from Vienna to Amsterdam, I think 5 or 6 days. So that's the way he goes, that we identify a boat that is going in early 1833, and we get him across to Boston. As for the figure of Beethoven, as you rightly say, that this is somebody we all respect intensely, and a lot of us have very powerful feelings about him. I thought, I can't invent words for Beethoven, and he has to speak, he has to have conversations, he has to converse. So what do I do? And I decided that everything Beethoven says in the book is taken from his published letters. So from the English translations of his letters. So I don't ever give him words. All those phrases, all those sentences, he actually speaks. Of course, I use them in different ways, but I didn't actually invent his speech. Another side of the problem, and maybe I'm going beyond what you've asked, but another side of the problem of his communicating with people, of course, is that by this stage, he is pretty well totally deaf. So that was another problem in the communication. How does he communicate? We can't have a novel in which the main figure can't hear what anybody is saying. It's ridiculous. So how do we do that?
Well, that is one of the most brilliant things about this book, and I found incredibly moving. And I thought, how come I never wondered whether there could have been a possibility that Beethoven could actually have communicated. So
Yeah.
say more about the wonderful figure of Thankful, brilliantly named as well,
Yes,
I should say.
yes, love that.
Yes, it is a lovely name. Well, my first thought was in Boston in 1833, maybe medicine was more advanced than it was in Vienna, and maybe Beethoven's hearing could have been restored, at least somewhat. But I think the more you read about Beethoven's deafness, it's not just a problem of the physical ear, but of the whole ear-brain stuff that allows you to hear. So it may have been beyond any medical solution. And I was visiting my younger son Rupert in Peru, and we were talking about this problem in a car. And he said, how far was Boston from Martha's Vineyard? And I said, well, it's just around the corner. It's there. And he said, well, I think there was a deaf-dumb sign language on Martha's Vineyard. And we got to the hotel, got into our separate rooms, both jumped to our laptops to Wikipedia. And indeed, there was a Martha's Vineyard sign language. And it developed on Martha's Vineyard because in the early 19th century, 10% of the population was deaf and dumb. And that was because one chap from Kent in the 1650s or something had landed up there, and he'd spread the gene. So you were very likely to have somebody in your extended family who was deaf. And also it became a useful private language. You could converse with your friends. If somebody strange was around, you could carry on conversations. They hadn't a clue what was going on. It happens here in Wales that people use Welsh for exactly that purpose, as a private language. So everybody on the island knew this language.
I liked the intimacy that came from that relationship with Thankful. The idea that you communicate without words. And it struck me that the other female character, Hannah Hill, also likewise had this, the way that, you know, Beethoven communicated with her was a kind of respect, like a empathy that was mostly not from words. And I loved that. It sort of gave us a feeling for Beethoven as a deeply empathetic and man who could read people's characters so well. And that sort of rang,
yes.
Maybe it's just a performer, but it sort of rings true to that internal side of him, I guess.
Well, one thing I wanted this novel to have was some kind of whole, satisfying romantic friendship with somebody of the opposite sex, something he hadn't had. And Thankful is totally invented character, of course. But Hannah Hill, actually, there was this person, Hannah Hill. So she was there waiting for me. Whoops. Is that you or me?
I think it might be
I don't know.
Hannah Hill was there waiting because I have Beethoven, almost every year, maybe every year in the summer months, 3-4 months, he would leave Vienna, as a lot of people did who had the means to do that, go out to what was then a village on the outskirts of Vienna to spend the summer, walk in the countryside, which he loved to do, compose, of course, but really be out in nature among the woods and the rocks and the streams and so on. So I thought, well, he's got to do that when he's in Boston as well. I think he arrives in the springtime, April, May. And then in the summer, he goes out to the country and he goes to the estate of Josiah Quincy, who had this, there's a present suburb of Boston called Quincy. It was then the family estate, and he's invited out there. And various relations of Quincy come and go while Beethoven's there. And one person who's there is this cousin of Quincy's called Hannah Hill. She's a widow. And so I have her, I think in reality, she was a couple of years older than Beethoven, but I don't think I bother with that too much. But I imagine somebody, I don't really know anything about what the real Hannah Hill was like, but I imagine somebody of great intelligence, great sympathy, somebody who is very respectful of Beethoven, but at the same time treats him as a human being. And he needs her, well, the romantic friendship develops, but he needs her in the first place because he needs help with the libretto. It was part of the commission that the oratorio be in English. That's two things we know about the commission. It was to be a biblical oratorio and in the English language. And he has a libretto written for him by a Boston clergyman. And just for the fun of it, I imagine this libretto as being rather poor, and he's having trouble writing the oratorio. There are lots of references in Beethoven correspondence to how important words are, and that comes out in the book a bit. But he was, you don't think of Beethoven as being a great reader, but he was. And in the conversation books, you can see him jotting down titles of books that he wants to go along to the bookshop and get. He was a reader, and he was very aware of the quality of the words he was setting in his opera and in songs. Of course, he was enormously attached to Goethe's poetry, and if he had lived to 1833, then rather than this oratorio, he might have gone on to write a setting of Faust. So he is a very literally, that adverb exists, aware musician. He knows he's on a hiding to nothing with the libretto he's given, and he sees in Hannah Hill very quickly that this is somebody with the skills and the intelligence and the taste and the sympathy with his music who can help him. So she writes the libretto, and nobody is told. It's part of their close relationships that they know where the librettos come from, but nobody else does.
I wanted to go back maybe one step in your approach to writing. The book that you gave Rick and I when you were here last, whatever, 10 years ago, a little more, was Let Me Tell You.
Yeah.
And of course it has that Oulipian restriction of the 483 words that Ophelia speaks in Hamlet. And it strikes me that you enjoy that, restriction in your writing. In this case, I suppose it's not the fact that Beethoven only speaks the words that he actually wrote in his letters. does that idea come from working with composers, or is that really just, in other words, so many composers rely on setting rules for themselves, and then that allows them
Oh,
to
absolutely.
create. Yeah.
I mean, Stravinsky was very clear about this, saying more than once, you know, set me a framework, give me rules, give me conditions, and then I can work. I can't just write music. You have to know what it was for, how long is it going to be, so on. Yeah, but I think that's not uncommon for writers too. Georges Perec, who I admire greatly, as I think is obvious in what I do, said I can't deal with a blank sheet of paper. I've got to have some rules. I've got to have something that defines what I'm doing before I do it. So yes, I do feel that. And but let me tell you, which also has a kind of Cornell connection, because that's what Zach, what you brought me to Cornell for in the first place. That piece that we did with Francis Marie Whitty,
Right.
also used the Ophelia language. Let Me Tell You was a novel that I wrote. Well, it took 13 years to write. So I can't say I wrote it in the 90s, because it started in the 80s and it ended up in the next century. And it uses only the words spoken by Ophelia in the play, or in the 3 extant texts of the play. And you can have an idea like that in about 2 seconds. And as I say, it takes you 13 years to do it. And what kept me going through those 13 years, if this isn't too arrogant, I thought nobody else is going to have the patience to do this. It is so hard. Anybody else is going to give up after a year or 2 years, because it's just so hard. You keep writing things. To begin with, it would take me an afternoon to write a sentence. You keep wanting to use words that you don't have. For instance, this is a first-person narrative. Ophelia is telling her own story in the book, and she doesn't have the word am. So she can never say I am. She can only say I would be, or I have been, or I would have been, or whatever. She can never say I am.
I know that carries over actually into this book. The whole the part where she has her own soliloquy, or it's one chapter called A Monologue. First of all, she starts every grouping of sentences as "let me tell you," which I thought was clever, self-reference. Yeah. But also often when you're writing, you're saying, perhaps it was, as the narrator is just making it up as he goes. I love that. I mean, maybe that idea came originally from Ophelia. I don't know. It is.
Be, and actually, Beethoven, I say everything Beethoven says is quoted from Leslie. He does use the phrase, or Emily Anderson has him using the phrase "let me tell you." So we have Beethoven saying "let me tell you" as well. Yeah. Yes. Well, there we are. Cross-reference.
Thank you, Paul. I love the book. I have to show my copy as well. It was really enchanting.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I love the way you built up the tension of getting to hear the piece. When are we going to hear the piece? When are we going to see the piece? And then for me, the climax of the book is when you describe the piece towards the end. And I that was just so masterful. How do you describe a piece of music so intimately unless you had heard it yourself? You must have heard something in your head. Did you write out anything, or did you?
No, I wish. I mean, what? When Hollywood gets in touch with me, one of the problems is going to be who writes the film score, because you couldn't film this book without filming the premiere. You've got to have at least a couple of minutes of music, and I cannot imagine who might convincingly produce a couple of minutes of what I call fourth period Beethoven, because he's now moved on into his fourth period. Of course, we're now several years past when he notionally died. But yeah, I kind of I describe a couple of the pieces that he's also writing while he's in Boston and Quincy, and some pieces that he's written before he gets there. And we talk about those a little bit. But then I had to really discuss it in some detail. The piece that we hear, and when we get that in rehearsal, and then we get the actual performance. So I know I have absolutely no idea what this thing sounds like, but
I think
I had to come up with
it would be great to give that description to some Cornell composition students and make them write a piece that fits that description.
Yeah, but I mean, it's quite apart from the peak on which Beethoven is. Quite apart from that, we are 200 years on, or very nearly, from 1833, and it's funny how these things just become impossible. I don't know why. I don't quite know why it is. Why is it impossible for somebody to write Brahms's Fifth Symphony now? I mean, it just cannot be done. It just cannot be done.
Yeah.
So I don't know what Hollywood's going to do then.
I mean, maybe Paul, this is where you find somebody with a mind like yours, a composer with a mind like yours, whoever that might be, who's willing to go back to the sketchbooks and all of those fragments and moments that speak of some piece that didn't emerge, or some moment in a piece that didn't emerge. And the same way that you created Beethoven's voice out of fragments from the letters, you could almost imagine some kind of kaleidoscopic thing that's actually made out of Beethoven's notes that is Beethoven but isn't. I mean, obviously it would be impossible to hear the whole thing, but I felt the kind of, I could imagine a kind of representation that somehow was fragments that were the real thing, even though the whole thing is something entirely different.
And you could maybe have scenes of instrumentalists practicing.
Yeah.
You know, this is a bassoon line, or whatever, and then we're going to the Boylston Hall in Boston, and then the doors are closed, and we don't actually get to hear the.
Or you're back into Beethoven's deafness. You're back into that world of
Yeah,
I don't know.
You're hearing what he hears, which may be some low register stuff. Yeah, that's a nice idea.
Oh yeah, that's true.
But
I loved that you right in the early 20s or mid 20s he was making a collection of Renaissance music, right? And you mentioned
yes,
Heinrich, who was it? Heinrich Isaac. Yeah.
Yes. Well, that's not true. I mean, that's.
Well, but when he was preparing his mass, right? When he was writing the late sonatas, he was interested.
Yeah, and he has the, in the Lydian
right
tonart, whatever that is, mode. Yes. So yeah, I mean, I don't think we know how far back. I mean, he must have heard 16th century polyphony. Lassus and Palestrina would still have been being performed, so he'd have been aware of that. But it's a very interesting question. What Renaissance music could Beethoven have heard? I really don't know if anybody's looked into that. I don't think he went to church that often, but in his youth, he did. He was the court organist in Bonn, so he'd have been there every Sunday. What did he hear?
But I like that you reference 132 and say that there's this struggle between tonality and modes, and that last part of oratorio. That got me excited imagining what that might have sounded like.
Yes, but you said something about. Let me tell you, and my fiction writing, I suppose, more generally, about the influence of talking to composers and indeed listening to music, and thinking about music and writing about music, I think it's undoubtedly there, that composers are much more used to dealing with restrictions of material, restrictions of form, whatever, and that I find very sympathetic. Yes, that's true. The idea of using words, if you're writing for the piano, you've got 88 notes and that's it. If you're writing, let me tell you, you've got 490, whatever it is, words, and that is it, and you can't put in new ones.
And thank you for the clarinet quintet. Thank you for
Yeah.
Great for you.
taunting clarinetist.
And the very bizarre G flat minor piano trio.
Yeah.
I thought, wow, Paul's really having fun with these pieces.
Well, I found something just the other day, because I'm reading. I should have done this before, I suppose, but I'm now reading lots and lots of Beethoven books because I'm supposed to do a review for the Times Literary Supplement, and I've got a 7 or 8 Beethoven books. And I was reading something. There was some reference to the Eroica. There's a lot about the Eroica in one of these books, and one of the German music magazines at the time says that Beethoven is working on a symphony in D sharp. So there you go.
Oh. I especially love the chapter with all the dynamics, that has all the dynamics. And that is really just love. I would love to hear that acted out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I hope it
No,
was...
I think I must have dreamt, but I thought Beethoven did this in one of his letters. And then I went through the whole thing, it's 1,500 pages, and I can't find it. So I really don't know if he did. But yeah, there's one conversation. As I said, Beethoven and Hannah Hill are keeping this private between them, what's going on with the oratorio, and even the subject of the oratorio, which is kept private from the reader for half the book. And Beethoven gets the wrong end of the stick, which I'm sure he did a good deal, and he thinks that Mrs. Hill has divulged the topic of the oratorio. So they have this little argument. It's the one moment of real friction between them. And so I thought, well, let's deal with this with dynamic marking so that he can say fortissimo and she's a mezzo forte, and then on they go.
Yeah.
Do you, is there a section you could read to us with Hannah Hill?
Yeah. Beethoven first meets Hannah Hill at dinner at the Quincy house.
Yeah.
And he realizes they both start out a little bit chary of each other, but very rapidly they realize that they have more in common with each other than they do with anybody else in the room. And he invites her to go and see him. Beethoven and Thankful have been given a little cottage near the main house at Quincy. Here we are. So Mrs. Hill has come in. It would not have taken Mrs. Hill very long to observe the mass of papers and the composer, perhaps still with pen in hand, as he got up from his chair. "My dear sir," she would have to say, "I fear my arrival is inopportune. You are evidently in the ecstasy of composition. I should never have come. Indeed, I should never have come." From watching Thankful's hands, Thankful is conveying this to Beethoven, the composer slowly turned his head to look at Mrs. Hill with sadness in his eye. "Am I not your true friend?" he said. "It does me good to revive the old feelings of friendship." Then he clapped his hands and added, "Now no more, my dear sweet friend." Knowing that the composer was inclined to forget the courtesies, Thankful motioned to Mrs. Hill to take a seat. She herself remained standing, as was her custom. "Meanwhile," the composer began again, "I've been composing a good deal." "That is very good to hear," said Mrs. Hill. Then, entirely to her surprise, the composer beckoned her to pull up her chair alongside his, at the same time catching Thankful's eye and signing, "Please have the chocolate." While Thankful was out of the room, the composer cleared space on the desk and brought a pile of folios, his fair copy, to the floor. "You will probably be able to read my manuscript," he said. Mrs. Hill almost certainly realized that once it would have been rare for him to take anyone into his creative confidence, especially where a major work in progress was concerned. But she may not have realized quite how rare. She would have suspected immediately, too immediately to be astonished, that she was to be introduced to the Boston Oratorio. And it would not have taken her long to recognize that this was so, and even to form in her mind some impression of a choir and orchestra in severe flood. The music was plunging and rearing up through shadows like a ship on a strong sea in a thunderstorm, but all a little in slow motion. She nodded to the composer to reveal the next page. At Thankful's return, she was able to speak, and hardly knowing what to say first, came out with, "This treatment of the submediant is extraordinarily powerful." There you go.
Brilliant. It's a beautiful scene. I just love that scene. It's so much is said, and she's such a fantastic figure too. The fact that she has the expertise to come right out talking about the submedian. I love that. I just think it's really beautifully done.
You see,
Yeah, well, there's no reason. Yeah, I mean, she's an intelligent woman. She had the musical education, yes, and in her day, there was a girls' school in Boston. Her wretched cousin Josiah Quincy III closed it down.
I thought, as you researched all these figures, how much fun you must have had. The Quincy's, the Masons especially, I thought. I loved that one of my favorite scenes is the game of checkers with Mason Jr., the son. He's like 9 or 10 years old, like he's a real figure.
That's right, yeah.
Right. So, and I love that he just kind of comes in and says, "Hey, Beethoven, you want to play some checkers?" Or Dama or whatever you call it. And then they play, and you see how Beethoven, again, relates so well to someone who's not genuflecting and, you know, treating him like the great genius or expecting it, like, when the hell is this piece going to be done? It's just having a kind of normal relationship with a younger person. And then, I don't know if it's coincidental, the highlight or one of the highlights at the end of the oratorio, it's a boy soprano solo that Mason Jr. sings. Was that a sort of tribute to his friendship with him?
Well, Zach, you played that tune when I did the messenger lectures, because it's actually from excuse me, from 1820, from one of the conversation books, and Beethoven writes down this. It's a bit like a folk tune, but I don't think anybody's ever identified it as a folk tune. So I thought, well, let's bring this in. It's obviously made for 4 lines of verse, and let's use this. And since it's in a soprano register that would be suitable for a boy's voice, let's have a boy in this oratorio. And to start off, Lowell Mason, the best known as a hymn writer, of course, is one of the big wheels in the Handel and Haydn Society, one of the people there to meet Beethoven on the quayside as he comes. And he had 4 boys, and I imagine one of these boys having this role. Lowell Mason's going to conduct the performance, so he has a say in the casting. And his top son is sort of 12, 13. So let's have his voice break. And then the number 2 son has to take over. And let's prepare this by having the relationship exist between Beethoven and this boy. And the obvious way for them to make contact is through a game. So Lowell Mason waits his chance and knocks on the door and goes in and says, "Yeah." And so game of checkers, exactly as you said. So Beethoven only using to repeat phrases and sentences from his letters has to take part in this game of checkers.
I loved that as a pianist, you had the Chickering family in there, of course.
Yep.
And then I didn't realize that Lowell Mason Jr.'s brother they're the ones who had a publishing house, and then they became Mason and Hanlon Pianos.
Exactly.
Which
yeah.
is which is right there, and is my absolute favorite piano to play. I mean, it's so.
Oh right. Well, we
you.
have Annie's piano here.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. We have the documentation going back now almost a century. It was her grandmother's piano. So I mean, yeah, that was another good reason to have the Masons in here. Yeah, I think they all
incredible
followed musical careers. And then there was a Daniel Gregory Mason who became something of a composer. I think he was a grandson of Lowell Mason, or maybe a great grandson.
And of course, Lowell Mason was a very important collector of music too. So the Lowell Mason Codex for organists, a very important collection of 17th century North German music, some of which only exists in that manuscript. So
that's
really
interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
He started, I think, the first Sunday school for all Black children in Savannah, Georgia. I mean, he's just and all this.
Yes, that's where he was before Boston. Yeah, I don't know quite why.
And the way he spread music education throughout the. I mean, he must have been an incredible man. And he was a big
very
organist,
energetic,
right?
very powerful person. Yes.
Yeah.
But the scrap of music from 1820 that becomes this voice soprano solo in the oratorio, that's all that survives of the oratorio, because the rest of it has been burnt. Of course, actually, the oratorio doesn't exist at all. But had it existed, there actually was a fire in the music publisher's warehouse a few days after the performance. So all the material goes back to the publisher's warehouse and is lost, apart from the scrap that Lowell Mason Jr. copied out for his own study. It's right at the end, yeah. If you go right through to the last note, yes. Following the performance, the musical materials would have been returned to the office of Charles Bradley, and so lost in the fire there 5 days later. Information from Wikisource.
Rick was noticing. Oh, you asked the question about the fourth wall and the influence, Rick.
Yeah, you're very open in how much the internet has helped you write the book, and that kind of pops up in the book, which I find really interesting.
Yeah, indeed. I thought, well, historical novels normally they put flesh over the skeleton, and that's part of the charm. That's one thing you want. You don't want to be told, well, actually, Mary of Burgundy did this on the 2nd of February, but it suited me to make it the 18th of May. I mean, you don't want all the research in there. But I thought, well, here we can, because we're imagining something that never happened. And so the rule, if you like, was to make it all plausible, that it could have happened. So instead of just simply inventing about, I find a boat that could have taken Beethoven over there. And we find a person in Boston, Josiah Quincy III, who could have given Beethoven lodging for the summer months, and so on. And I mean, things that I encountered along the way, like that there was a sale of paintings that had belonged to President Jefferson. So bang that in as well, and maybe Beethoven was there. And of course, he's there from spring to autumn, so he's there for July the 4th celebration. So we have July the 4th at the Quincy household.
I was glad to see Melville. As a big Melville fan, I was happy to see Melville there.
Well, that was another. One of you talked about having fun. That was another thing that I thought let's get in as many people, well-known figures as we as we possibly can. And in fact, there weren't too many well-known composers that we know now. Excuse me. The only one of the Beethoven period who's at all known now is Anthony Philip Heinrich, who had the name of Beethoven of Kentucky, who did spend time in Boston. Excuse me. But he wasn't in Boston by the time he'd gone back to Germany. But writers there were, of course. So we have Melville, and we have Longfellow, and we have one or two more. More or less.
Is Melville's friend Walt? Is that Walt Whitman?
Yeah, of course. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're almost of an age. I think Whitman was a year and a bit older, and Whitman, as a teenager, we're at that period of their lives, was working for newspapers in New York. So it's possible that he could have. Yeah, maybe we shouldn't give the whole thing away. Okay.
And it does seem to me that the book is very filmic, right? It would lend itself really great to be a play or to be a movie. I mean, did that ever enter into your mind?
Well, indeed, yeah, I know, but that's just the problem of the music. I mean, as a stage play, well, no, if you've got a play about a composer, you've got to have music. So that's, I mean, Annette's idea of having, little fragments, and then what we came up with, having it heard as if through Beethoven's ears. I don't know, or maybe one of your composition students can fake fourth period Beethoven.
I'm not so sure.
One thing that Rick pointed out was that often each chapter has a completely different writing style, and
yeah.
he wondered if there was a Joycean kind of influence, or that's just something, because I don't think of. Have you done that before?
Yes.
I could. Oh, you have.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, Joyce is a great model, of course, for that kind of thing. But one thing that I think there's a little bit of that in Let Me Tell You, but Let Me Tell You, it was just such a triumph to write a sentence I couldn't really be concerned about style.
Right.
But one thing I like the possibility of in writing is having something that's, and again, this has a lot to do with music and with contemporary music in particular, having something that's very disconnected, that doesn't go A, B, C, D, goes A, F, B, X, all over the place, but still feels continuous and integral, and we're not just moving at random. You never get it. You never get it. It's an ideal, but that's something to strive for.
But I think you did. I felt that. What you describe.
Well, thank you.
I certainly felt. Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.
And it was like an advent calendar. When you turn the page to the new chapter, it was like a new gift and a wonderful
Yeah.
surprise. That was lovely. And then you circle back to the main theme. I was so artfully done.
Well, thank you. I mean, it enabled me to, the main narrative, if you like, is a progression. Beethoven arrives in Boston. He's working on the oratorio. They're not sure how quickly he's working on it. They get worried about whether they're going to get it in time for the performance or not. But then he does zoom forward, and it's rehearsed, and it's performed, and he leaves. So there is a kind of chronological narrative. But at the same time, we keep looking back at it as if it is something that we all know. So there are scholars and historians writing about it as if it really exists and is an accepted part of the Beethoven canon.
Yes. Knob Creek. Annette, you have nothing to drink?
Well, mine is in a mug.
Oh, that's serious.
I just take, volume. We're talking quantity here.
That's good. I like volume. Paul.
Yes.
Paul,
To
too.
you.
Cheers.
Oh, thank you.